The different viruses have different characteristics. They have different tropisms, different parts of the body, different kinds of tissues that they infect. They have different characteristics in the environment, different ways of spreading. So we need to have different programs for taking care of the different viral diseases. Pseudorabies has been one of the easiest diseases to eliminate from pig herds. It's still widespread in the pig industry around the world. In Europe, they still have some issues with it. The United States and Canada are cleaned up for it. So once the herd has moved from the acute form to the chronic form, it's certainly possible to eliminate pseudorabies by the stabilize, test, replace program. After the sow herd is moved from the acute phase to the chronic form, there aren't any problems anymore in the farrowing area. There's no pseudorabies related abortions and then no pseudorabies related mortality in the farrowing. The part of pseudorabies that's often failed to be recognized is the fact that pseudorabies is associated with pneumonia in the growing and finishing phase, and that is the main virus factory is growing and finishing. If you have pseudorabies negative gilts and put those into a vaccinated sow herd, they will indeed stay negative. This is the good thing about pseudorabies. The sow is highly immunocompetent. The sow is able to protect her piglets until several weeks after farrowing. Up until the time that the pigs are about 6 to 8 weeks of age, they will be still protected by the maternal antibody, and the sow is no longer shedding virus and spreading it from sow to sow, particularly if they're vaccinated. If you've revaccinated the sows and on a periodic basis, it's pretty easy to get pseudorabies under control. The reason that we fail to get pseudorabies under control is that we do not recognize the problem in the growing and finishing phase, and we do not take the effort that is necessary to eliminate the virus from the growing and finishing phase. The pneumonia that occurs in growing and finishing phase is very, very serious and is a huge problem. In the herd that has gone chronic, there's very little utility in continuing the perinatal at birth intranasal vaccination in the non-acute pseudorabies herd. And certainly whenever the disease is first breaking out, it's useful to do so. One of the important points is that it is much more valuable to vaccinate the little pig at weaning at about day 21 than it is to vaccinate them intranasally at birth. And one of the misconceptions is that pseudorabies is primarily a disease of sows and little pigs. The huge problem with pseudorabies is in the growing and finishing phase, and we want to get the pig prepared so that we can stop the disease in growing and finishing. So make the first intranasal vaccination at day 21, revaccinate the pigs again with modified live at 7 weeks of age, evaluate the pseudorabies status of the growing and finishing barn, and run those barns all in, all out, particularly if they're close by to the sow herd. They must be all in, all out. If the growing finishing barns are the source of the replacement females, absolutely they have to be run all in, all out. And if they're nearby, it's a very good idea to run them all in, all out, because they're producing a tremendous amount of virus that can mess up our program. Revaccinate the sows by mass vaccination 3 times yearly by the calendar. The sows vaccinated in that way will protect their piglets until the piglets are about 6 weeks of age. We do not need to vaccinate sows prior to farrowing to make sure that they protect their pigs. I prefer to use kill virus on the sows, but either modified live or kill virus vaccine will help. The replacement gilts, if they're negative at arrival, will remain negative even if they're in close contact with infected but vaccinated sows, and they'll push the older positive sows out of the herd through normal or through accelerated attrition. We can speed up the culling rate to get rid of the older sows and replace them with gilts. Sometimes sows are bringing a higher price than market hogs, and in that case, it's pretty easy to push the sows out of the herd. The USA pork industry eradicated pseudorabies by this method. It does indeed work very well. It's quite simple, but the difficult part of it is to convert the growing and finishing barns to all in, all out. That is the part that is the difference between success and failure with pseudorabies. It is often said that the Chinese virus is so much different from the vaccine viruses is why there's a problem. The thing that needs to be understood is that pseudorabies vaccination of piglets has never been perfect. It never provided perfect immunity, but it does provide highly stabilizing immunity for the sows. And so if you use a killed vaccine on the sows, it will certainly stabilize them. Even the modified live will work pretty well, and it will stabilize the sows. That's what you're trying to get done, not trying to protect the market pigs in a continuous flow situation. In a continuous flow situation, the pseudorabies virus has always been able to infect the pigs even though they were vaccinated. This has long been known to be the case. Classical swine fever main points. In CSF, the disease is vertically transmitted from the sow to her piglets. That's the main thing that is going on, is the vertical transmission. And so what we want to do is to eliminate the persistent infected sows. And where the sows have been vaccinated with a subunit vaccine, you can determine whether or not they've been infected. What you do is you vaccinate the gilts with the E2 subunit vaccine, and then whenever it's time for selection of the gilts, you check them to see whether or not they are positive for the ERNS E0 protein antibody. And if they're positive, then the gilts are culled. If they're negative, then they're accepted. So where the old sows are vaccinated with the C strain vaccine, it's a little bit more of a problem to tell whether or not they're infected with a wild virus or the field virus. There are some things that you can do with the ERNS E0 antibody, but it's a little bit fuzzy. We can also test the buffy coat and get rid of the sows from that standpoint. It might be useful to do some of that testing, but it's a little bit expensive relative to the relatively inexpensive cost of doing E0 antibody. The serology is not of any particular value in determining whether or not the sows are positive or negative. The E2 serology, the standard serology, we used to think that the sows, if they were negative, it meant that they were persistent infected. This is actually not true, and some of the sows that are persistent infected seem to have antibodies, so it's a little bit complicated from that standpoint. But we can use the ERNS E0 antibody if we are using the subunit vaccine. Sows that have poor productivity are likely to be persistent infected in a CSF problem herd. Sows that are infertile and produce poor litters are likely to be persistent infected, and they should be eliminated from a CSF problem herd. We should only vaccinate the gilts with the DIVA subunit E2 vaccine. Otherwise, whenever it comes time to select the gilts, we want to make sure that they're not persistent infected. We have to use some expensive molecular test. The LAMP test is not terribly expensive, but it's not very well accepted. So only verified CSF negative gilts are introduced into the herd, and then we can do sort of the same thing that we do with pseudorabies, simply a test and remove, and get rid of the classical swine fever virus out of the herd by attrition. That if you're vaccinating the sows with the subunit vaccine, they make very high immunity, unlikely, relatively speaking, to transmit the disease from the sows to the gilts. And if we put in negative gilts, we should be able to push the sows out of the herd. If we put in negative gilts, we should be able to push the PI sows out of the herd. Herds have cleaned up simply by removing the persistent infected sows by taking tonsillar biopsies. It's a lot of work and it's pretty hard. And you've got to have a supply of negative gilts. If you don't have negative gilts, you're not going to get anywhere. In a CSF problem with the diagnosis of CSF in the pigs, the sow herd must be stabilized and a source of negative gilts identified. And you can either give them the high doses of the MLV vaccine. I've used 20x doses and it works very well. Or you can use a subunit vaccine. You can mass vaccinate sows and then repeat in 3 weeks, 3 months, and every 3 months until the herd is stabilized. We had been able to clean herds up with the MLV vaccine, but the subunit vaccine is actually cheaper whenever you consider the cost of the high dose vaccination. The sow status can be verified with a lymphoid PCR test if you want to do that. That is a continuing good use of it. Of course, we have to have negative gilts to put back into the herd. And if we're not providing negative gilts, we're not going to get anywhere. And the DIVA subunit vaccine is a very cost-effective and convenient way. It does take a while to move the herd into the DIVA-capable situation because herds are using the modified live vaccine, which doesn't have the DIVA characteristic. PRRS is so common. Why should we want to bother to eliminate it? Some people believe that if you're infected with PRRS, you're going to be better off than if you're negative. They say that if you're negative for PRRS and then you get the virus, then it will cause you very serious problems, whereas if you're already positive, then you'll be okay. This is not true because a PRRS positive status doesn't really offer you any protection against infection with a new strain. Even among the NADC 30 strains, there isn't very much cross protection among the strains. Having been infected with a previous strain won't help you very much whenever the new one comes along. But even so, the economic loss caused by chronic PRRS in the nursery and chronic PRRS in the growing and finishing barn in the porcine respiratory disease complex, it finally gets to be a problem in a highly competitive pig market with market prices that are frequently below profitability. Also, the consumer demand for antibiotic restrictions and the general problem of antibiotic resistance will make it very difficult to treat secondary infections that occur after the animals have been debilitated by the PRRS virus and the alveolar macrophages have all been knocked out by the PRRS virus, and then strep infections and other secondary bacterial infections move in on the pig. Also, the PRRS virus will interfere with immunity to other diseases such as classical swine fever, very classically, and other diseases as well. The genetics and seed stock market will demand PRRS-free breeding stock, and producers will pay a premium to get certifiably PRRS-negative animals. I think this is true. And pigs that are free from PRRS have fewer problems, and the personnel in a PRRS-free herd will be able to concentrate on improving production. They could, instead of going around looking for sick pigs, they can check on the ventilation equipment. It won't take as many people, perhaps, if you don't have so many sick pigs to treat. In the chronically PRRS-infected sow herd, the virus moves from the infected sows that are still shedding the virus into gilts that are recently introduced into the sow herd. And so the farms are constantly culling sows, constantly introducing gilts, and the infected sows are passing the virus to the gilts. This maintains the cycle. The problem with PRRS is the cycling of the virus in the sow herd. Pseudorabies, the problem with pseudorabies is the cycling of the virus inside the growing and finishing barn. And although that may indeed occur with the PRRS virus, the thing that we're concerned about with PRRS is that it is going from the sows to the gilts, and then the gilts are infected for a long time and able to produce prenatally infected pigs. For several months after infection, they can still make prenatally infected pigs. And then that is a problem because those pigs, whenever they're weaned, will carry the virus into the nursery and then will continually have breaks of the disease in the nursery. In the case where we introduce a new PRRS virus, we could have the viral abortion syndrome again, where there are aborting sows and dead sows and all kinds of problems that are associated with an acute outbreak of PRRS. The elimination of PRRS from a swine herd focuses on the prevention of transmission of the virus from the infected sow to the naive gilt, and then from the infected sow to her piglets. Whenever we're able to wean PCR negative pigs, we can say that the sow herd has become stable. Now, some people will say that the sow herd becomes stable when the abortion stops. That's actually not stable for the PRRS virus. It is indeed a sort of stability. The virus is still being transmitted from the sow to the piglet, even though abortion is not occurring. The sow has enough immunity to protect the pigs against the abortion aspect of the thing, but there's not enough immunity to protect the piglets from carrying the disease into the nursery. And that is the thing that is still causing us trouble and costing us money. Whenever we're able to wean PRRS negative pigs in a previously PRRS positive herd, it is because the virus is no longer circulating in the sow herd because the sows, via the action of their immune system, has eliminated the PRRS virus from their body so that it's not moving from the sows into the pigs through the placenta. And that's what we call true stability. Once such true stability is reached, then it's relatively simple to produce PRRS negative nursery pigs and PRRS negative growing and finishing pigs and PRRS negative replacement animals, just simply by applying the principles of segregation and isolation. You may have to bubble depopulate the nursery to get a space for the pigs. When you wean those negative pigs, you can move them into a clean nursery, and then they'll grow up and be PRRS negative. Indeed, the PRRS virus can move through the air, but you need to take care of it at home first. The PRRS virus becomes resident in cells of the immune system and remains in the animal for several months. And so as the immune cells reach the end of their life and they're replaced, the PRRS virus has to find new cells to go into. And so if the animal has a lot of antibody in its bloodstream that's wanting to pick up on the PRRS virus and cleaning it out of the tissues and the bloodstream, then the transition of the virus from cell to cell comes to an end, and then the animal becomes PRRS free. And this process typically takes about 7 months. It can happen a little more quickly if you vaccinate the sow with a kill virus vaccine, because then it will stimulate her immune system and speed this process up somewhat. On the herd level, the PRRS stability can be achieved by breaking the sow to replacement gilt cycle of transmission. There's this cycle of the virus moving from the sow to the replacement gilt, then that gilt passes the virus to another gilt, and that is the cycle that we want to break down. Now, if we close the sow herd to new gilt entries for 7 months or longer, then the infected gilts will all have the opportunity to get infected and have enough time to become virologically negative. We could say this is like removing the fuel from the fire. We're not putting in any more gilts, and so the virus doesn't have any new places to go to. People call this burning out the PRRS virus. So we burn it out by excluding gilts from the sow herd. This has been a successful strategy for eliminating the PRRS virus all over the world, and it works in China as well. You simply don't put in any more gilts, and the virus will burn itself out. It creates production problems because if you don't put in gilts and the sows then naturally fall out of the system, then the sow numbers go down and the number of pigs produced in the facility goes down for a period of time. But in some situations, it's worth it to get over the problem and create a PRRS negative herd, particularly if the herd is valuable genetics herd that is producing animals as part of a genetic pyramid. The PRRS virus in China, we have 4 main subtypes of the North American type PRRS in China. We do also have the European PRRS virus, but the main virus types that we have are the classic North American PRRS, which is a VR2332-like. We have so-called Chinese PRRS, the so-called high virulence PRRS virus. We have NADC30, which is the lineage 1 PRRS virus, and there are a lot of variants of NADC30. It's been causing abortion storms since 2014 and is most of the PRRS that we see in China today. And then the QYYZ-like PRRS, and it's mostly a problem in nursery pigs. Some people might say it's a kind of PRRS light, a very simple variety of PRRS. We usually haven't had to deal with it very much. It's mostly a problem in the nursery pigs and is relatively mild. But it is important to know which PRRS virus that you're dealing with, because as you go on, if for some reason the program seems to have failed or seems to be failing, it is good to know whether or not it is failing because we still having problems with the same virus, or if for some reason through a fault in biosecurity we have introduced a new virus. It's good to know what's going on. It can't be said that there's absolutely no cross protection among the different genotypes of PRRS, but the protection is generally quite poor. Some of the herds that were infected with classical PRRS or with the HP PRRS were not protected at all whenever NADC30 came along, and herds that have been affected with various lineage 1 PRRS viruses are not protected from other lineage 1 PRRS viruses. So really, there isn't very much cross protection, at least not very useful cross protection. And indeed, the PRRS virus is in the business of trying to change itself constantly. The use of ropes and oral fluids and these kinds of things are very popular because they're rather non-interventionist strategies that nobody has to get into the pen, nobody has to bother the pigs very much. It's something that could be done by the workers, doesn't require highly technical, skilled people to perform. But there's nothing like getting in there with the pigs and finding out what the body temperatures are and finding out whether or not they've really got a PRRS-like infection, and selecting some pigs with fever for necropsy and doing the diagnostic to prove that the animals have PRRS and they don't have PRRS. And a complete workup is always a good idea if you really want to know what's going on. Maintaining an elimination status. China is likely to eradicate CSF on a national basis in the next few years. There are some global pressures on transboundary diseases. Of course, now, since ASF has entered the picture, CSF is not such a big deal as it was before, but it's still there. Pseudorabies is probably the easiest disease to eradicate because it's not as insidious as CSF is, and it probably is likely to be a national program because indeed pseudorabies is in some cases a zoonotic disease that can cause a very serious, howbeit not particularly common, fortunately not very common, a problem in people. PRRS is unlikely to be nationally eradicated anytime soon, but the herds that clean up for serious viral diseases, they have to be diligent and vigilant with their animal introductions because it's very easy to get reinfected. And you've got to control the people. You've got to control the trucks. We love to control people. We like to wash vegetables and do all these kinds of theater kinds of things. But it's the trucks and the animals that we buy that usually introduce the infection. It usually is not the people. However, we need to make the people change their clothes and shower in and all these things.